In the spring of 1944, German soldiers along the northern French coast were tense. Reports kept coming in about Allied ships and planes moving across the channel. Orders were clear: defend the Atlantic Wall at all costs. Trenches were inspected, bunkers reinforced, cannons readied, and traps set along the beaches. Officers knew an attack was coming, but they don't know when. On the night of June 5th, soldiers stayed awake under the dark sky, listening to distant engines and the hum of reconnaissance planes. By dawn on June 6th, the assault erupted. Naval bombardments shook the coast. Planes rained bombs from above. Communication lines were shattered. Many units never received orders. Men fought alone, without reinforcements, without air support. Ammunition ran out. Positions were surrounded and overrun. Within days, the front began to crumble. Retreat was chaotic, escape uncertain, and for many, death was unavoidable. The soldiers whispered in fear, wondering if anyone would survive the hours ahead. Amid the smoke and dust, one thought persisted in everyone's mind. How long could they survive before everything collapsed completely? In the quiet village of Mallières-d'Aval, just south of the Somme Estia, soldier Heinrich Burl passed the days writing letters to his wife. It was the only thing that kept him sane. Mornings started late. Meals were modest. The trenches were checked and reinforced. And by 10 p.m., the night watch began, 4-hour shifts staring out at the dark sea. Burl had already spent 3 long years in France, first at Cap Green, now here along the estuary. Every day felt the same, a monotonous stretch of waiting. In August 1943, he wrote, "If only we could see the English face to face, anything would be better than this endless boredom. Maybe if they tried and failed here, it could turn the war, but no one knows what's coming." For almost 4 years, soldiers stationed in France had been far from the horrors of the Eastern Front, the deserts of Africa, or the mountains of Italy. But in spring 1944, the signs were impossible to ignore. 500,000 obstacles had been placed, millions of explosives buried, trenches connected machine gun nests, hundreds of kilometers of wire sprawled across the cliffs, concrete bunkers bristled with artillery and deadly traps, flooded fields, minefields, spiked barricades awaited any landing force. Behind the line, the German support network was already under fire. Air raids grew larger, sometimes 700 planes at a time, targeting trains, bridges, and depots. By June, over 76,000 tons of bombs had already fallen, severing supply lines and cutting off reinforcements. Soldiers could feel it in their bones. Near Bayeux, Artillery Chief Vera Pluscat told his men what he had never said before: "A dead soldier cannot defend the homeland." On the western cliffs near Colville, 18-year-old Lookout Gaukel scanned the channel from a thick concrete shelter. "We hardly saw German planes here," he recalled. "We nicknamed them Max and Moritz. Cannons were being installed, some real, some decoys." And the veterans whispered among themselves, "Something is coming." By late 1943, Berlin sent one of its most celebrated generals to take a closer look. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of North Africa, arrived in France to inspect the Atlantic Wall. What he found shocked him. The fortifications looked strong on paper, but were hollow in reality. Unfinished bunkers, exposed gun positions, and miles of undefended shoreline. Rommel wanted the Allies stopped on the beaches, and he made that clear from the start of 1944. After inspecting the French coast, he wrote that the most dangerous moment for any landing force is the instant they touch the sand. His solution was relentless: into a continuous line of defenses with machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, and heavy artillery. In his view, if the enemy ever got past that first line, they might never be pushed back. But with preparation, he believed they could be stopped. The bigger problem was the skies. The Luftwaffe in France was barely functional. Pilots were scattered, aircraft were few, and leadership was more concerned with comfort than combat. Rommel watched helplessly as plans for improvised airfields and fake bases dragged on, knowing air support might vanish when it was most needed. On land, disagreements ran deep. Rommel wanted troops on the beaches. Others, including Rundstedt, wanted them held back as reserves. Hitler's insistence on controlling the movement of armored units made quick decisions impossible. In April, a meeting divided the tanks, half under Rommel, half with the High Command. Orders required Hitler's approval. Bureaucracy slowed every move. Every argument, every delay, every rigid protocol meant one thing. When the first landing craft reached the shore, soldiers would pay the price. The coast might look fortified, but in those crucial first moments, nothing was guaranteed. The night of June 5th was quiet, almost normal, but that calm hid the storm. German soldiers on the coast tried to rest, rotated through night watches, and scanned the dark horizon. But reports began trickling in just after midnight. Paratroopers were landing inland, scattered and confused. Some officers thought it was a feint, a trick to pull forces from the beaches. By 4 a.m., the truth could no longer be ignored. Thousands of Allied ships had gathered off Normandy, and the first waves of naval artillery began pounding the shore. Cannons on the cliffs shook, trenches filled with debris, and men scrambled for cover. Orders from Berlin arrived too late. Tanks stationed inland stayed put because permission to move was slow, tangled in bureaucracy. Soldiers fought with what they had, isolated and under constant bombardment. Communication lines were cut. Radios jammed, and officers ran between positions trying to coordinate a defense that had no clear command. Rommel, called back from leave, reached headquarters by evening to find the situation already out of control. The Allies had gained a foothold that would only grow. Without air support, with armored units split and delayed, the German defenses collapsed. Requests to withdraw or regroup were denied. Hitler insisted on holding every position. Men on the beaches realized too late that help would not come, that no counterattack could arrive in time. The first hours of June 6th had sealed the fate of the Western Front, leaving soldiers to fight alone as the tide of war crashed over them. And among them was one soldier whose war had turned into a nightmare. Gustav Winter was trapped in a concrete tomb. Once a Panzer III tank crewman, he now sat motionless in a turret embedded in a solid block of concrete on a dune behind Omaha Beach. His unit, the 726th Regiment of the 716th Static Division, relied on him to fire at anyone trying to leave the water. The tank had no engine, no wheels, just a cannon operated by a hand crank. Only he and his loader remained inside, a fixed point in a line of defenses stretching across the dunes. From here, machine guns and artillery covered the shoreline, while the beaches bristled with metal obstacles designed to shred landing craft. Before this, Winter had served in France and Russia. The harsh, icy environment in the east had left him frostbitten, missing fingers, and permanently numb feet. He had seen entire crews freeze to death, their bodies stiff as statues. Reassigned to train recruits and later to trucks, he eventually returned to the Atlantic Wall, his expertise adapted to the static cannon. His assistant, a young Czech German, followed orders with eagerness, though often clumsy. Life behind the concrete was strangely semi-normal. French villagers traded bread, milk, and eggs for cigarettes or shoelaces. Soldiers hunted seagulls and rabbits. Rumors of bombed civilian homes traveled quickly, feeding fear and anger. Winter blamed the Allies, believing they drew attention away from the Eastern Front. Some soldiers had children with locals. Stories of tragedy made him bitter. He spent hours staring at the sea, trapped in his turret, feeling the tension of anticipation and dread. History moved outside his concrete box, unstoppable, and he could do nothing but watch. At 5:15 in the morning, the first massive explosions hit. Winter and his assistant huddled low in the concrete Panzer III, the walls vibrating with each impact. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. Through the narrow slit, Winter glimpsed the horizon, an endless fleet of ships cutting across the gray water, hundreds of planes slicing through the clouds overhead. The noise was overwhelming, deafening even through the concrete. Landing crafts hit mines almost immediately. Some were ripped apart, sending men and debris into the churning sea. Bodies floated past, tangled in wreckage. The water was dotted with twisted metal and burning wood. Winter gritted his teeth and tried to focus on his task, operating the cannon, but every moment outside seemed to stretch into an eternity. His assistant, barely 17, trembled beside him, eyes wide with terror. The naval guns didn't stop. Sand and concrete shrapnel rattled the turret, smoke leaking through every crack. Winter cracked the hatch slightly to look out. Bunkers nearby had collapsed into smoking craters. The dunes, once quiet and still, were now a landscape of fire and destruction. He could see the green flag of a nearby anti-tank gun, still standing, waving weakly amid the chaos. From their position, Winter could only watch history crush everything around him. The invading forces had not even reached the shore properly, yet the beaches were already littered with death and destruction. Every second was a reminder that no help was coming, that the walls of concrete could not shield them from the storm that had finally arrived. And still, the bombardment raged on, unrelenting, as the first soldiers struggled to reach the sand. As the morning wore on, the Allied landing crafts pressed closer, crawling through a sea littered with wreckage. Explosions erupted beneath many of the barges, sending debris and soldiers into the water. Flames licked the waves, and bodies floated past, tangled in twisted metal. From their concrete positions, the German soldiers could see it all, the tide of men advancing under a storm of fire. In the dunes and towns just behind the beaches, chaos reigned. Machine gun nests spat bursts into the sand, while snipers picked off figures moving across the streets. Yet every attempt to slow the advance was met with relentless enemy numbers and superior firepower. German units scrambled from one defensive point to the next, often losing cohesion in the smoke and noise. Reinforcements were blocked by Allied aircraft and naval gunfire, leaving isolated groups to fight alone. Inside ruined houses, German infantry tried to hold intersections, firing from rifle slits and rubble-strewn doorways. They emptied magazines at shadows, unsure if their bullets struck friend or foe. Anti-tank positions fired until they were silenced by explosions, leaving guns smoking and crews gone. Even the snipers perched in towers or bell towers could only hold out briefly before being cut down or trapped under rubble. By mid-afternoon, the coastline was slipping from German control. Town after town fell as soldiers retreated or were cut off. Streets ran with smoke and the echoes of gunfire. Communications had collapsed. Officers were dead or missing. The once imposing defenses, built over years with concrete, mines, and barbed wire, were overwhelmed in hours. By nightfall, the German hold on the coast had ended. Units that had vowed to hold out were scattered or trapped, and the surviving soldiers faced the grim reality. The Atlantic Wall was broken, and no relief was coming. The chaos of the day left the coastline in enemy hands, and the question remained: could anyone survive long enough to regroup? In the hours after the initial landings, Rundsted's headquarters was awash in scattered contradictory reports. Messages crackled over damaged lines, each one more confusing than the last. Some spoke of paratroopers behind German positions, others of fires along the beaches, still others of ships being destroyed. But no one could confirm anything. Orders that did arrive were unclear, sometimes directly contradicting one another. Hitler, asleep during the early attacks, remained unaware of the scale. When he finally woke, he believed the landings at Normandy were a feint, a diversion meant to draw attention from some other point along the coast. Requests to deploy armored reserves went unanswered. Tanks that could have stemmed the advance remained idle, waiting for permission that never came. The Luftwaffe was absent, dispersed to distant fields with little fuel, no backup, and no coordination. At Rommel's headquarters, the situation was no better. He returned in the afternoon to find chaos. Roads were blocked by craters and wrecked vehicles. Reinforcements could not reach the front lines. Soldiers were isolated, some unaware that the beaches had already fallen. Rommel tried to coordinate a counterattack with the armored units, but Berlin's orders were delayed or absent. Each hour lost meant more ground and more lives slipping through their fingers. Some local commanders attempted independent action. Limited counterattacks were launched, but without air support, heavy artillery, or reinforcements, they were quickly repelled. Casualties mounted, morale collapsed, and communication remained fractured. By the evening, even the most disciplined units had fragmented. Every delayed decision came at a human cost. Men on the beaches and in the dunes fought desperately, only to discover that no help was coming. The rigid, centralized command system that had once been Germany's strength had become its undoing. Generals and soldiers alike were trapped in a web of bureaucracy and hesitation, unable to respond to the fast-moving reality before them. By nightfall, the Western Front was paralyzed. The Allies held firm on the coastline, and the German command, once confident in its walls and plans, could only watch as years of preparation crumbled in a single, brutal day. Each missed order, each hesitant command, had sealed the fate of hundreds of men. By mid-August 1944, the remnants of the German army in Normandy were cornered near Falaise. What had once been a retreat became a trap. The only escape route ran between Falaise and Argentan, a narrow corridor clogged with men, vehicles, and supplies. From the sky, Allied aircraft patrolled relentlessly. Every movement on the ground, trucks, tanks, even horse-drawn wagons, was spotted and attacked without mercy. The roads were a nightmarish jumble. Burning tanks blocked passage, artillery pieces were overturned, and corpses, both human and animal, littered the earth. Soldiers tried to push forward, some carrying the wounded, others dragging abandoned gear, but progress was agonizingly slow. Dust, smoke, and the stench of death filled the air. Every plane overhead meant sudden dives for cover. Many never got up again. Units were mixed beyond recognition. Infantry, armored crews, cooks, medics, and officers collided in a chaotic procession. Discipline broke down. Orders went unheard or were impossible to follow. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber's platoon spent 3 days moving a few kilometers, surviving on puddle water, sleeping beside the dead, their weapons running dry. When Allied shells fell silent, mortars or machine guns took their place. The noise never stopped. It became impossible to measure time. Some groups tried to slip through at night, using forests or back roads, but the majority were caught. Captured soldiers carried only memories of fire, blood, and smoke. Others fought desperately, firing whatever they could at the tightening cordon, but the trap was unrelenting. Tanks attempting to push forward became immobile, surrounded by wreckage and bodies. Survivors huddled beneath them, only to be exposed again to artillery or strafing attacks. By the time the corridor was fully sealed, 50,000 to 60,000 German soldiers were trapped. 10,000 were killed, and thousands more taken prisoner. Only a small fraction made it through the chaos. The field between Falaise and Argentan remained scarred for weeks. Blackened earth, wrecked vehicles, and the remnants of men and animals alike. The encirclement marked the end of organized German resistance in Normandy. Command had collapsed, morale shattered, and the army was no longer a cohesive force. What had begun as a retreat became a slaughter under open skies, without protection, without orders, and without hope. Only a few would emerge from the inferno, carrying the memories of what had been lost. After the crushing defeat in Normandy, thousands of German soldiers found themselves prisoners of the Allies. The surrender was often silent, hands raised, faces blank with shock, some still dazed from the fighting. Others stumbled from the rubble of destroyed towns, seeking any sign of safety. Their divisions no longer existed. Small groups drifted along rural roads, a mix of infantry, artillery crews, and support staff, many barefoot or bandaged, carrying only what they could salvage. Their march was slow, the sun beating down, dust and blood crusted on skin and uniforms. The Allies scrambled to set up camps, often nothing more than wire fences in open fields or courtyards hastily enclosed with barbed wire. Shelter was minimal, rations meager, and water scarce. Prisoners slept on the ground with no cover, surrounded by makeshift toilets or buckets. In the heat of summer, disease spread quickly. Some men tried to organize lines or shifts. Others gave up completely, frozen in place by exhaustion or despair. An officer watching the crowds described them as ghosts, hollow-eyed and filthy, murmuring only for news of home or loved ones. Officers among the captives often removed insignias or destroyed papers to avoid reprisals. Some tried to hide among the rank and file, blending in with soldiers they once commanded. Those identified were interrogated, but rarely offered comfort. Water and a chair were sometimes the only concessions. Entire groups were forced to march for dozens of kilometers in the sun, carrying wounded comrades or looting for anything edible. Many didn't survive the journey. Some young recruits, barely trained, scavenged routes to survive for days. Civilians, scarred by bombings and loss, sometimes attacked the prisoners. Stones, shouts, and insults greeted columns of soldiers moving through devastated villages. In some towns, captives were made to clear rubble, bury the dead, or rebuild damaged structures. Others were simply left to endure the heat, disease, and hunger until they could be transported deeper into France or across the Channel. Survival became a test of endurance as much as it was a test of obedience. Every day was a march, a shift in the sun, a line of wire, a ration barely enough to keep moving. Hope was a fragile thing, held only by those who refused to stop walking. Even as the front crumbled in Normandy, Hitler remained deep in his Rastenburg bunker, surrounded by maps, reports that were incomplete or outdated, and generals too afraid to speak the truth. Early news came in fragments. Hours passed before real events reached him. For the first days of the invasion, he refused to acknowledge Normandy as the main landing. In his mind, the real assault would hit Kalala. He ordered the armored reserves to stay put. Tanks sat idle while soldiers died along the coast. When reports reached him of Allied breakthroughs, he erupted. Commanders had supposedly failed, disobeyed, betrayed him. Long nights were spent reviewing maps, pointing at roads and divisions that no longer existed, demanding movements that were impossible. The generals stayed silent, terrified of contradicting him. Only a handful repeated his words, never the truth. Rommel's injury further strained the command. With the field marshal removed from action, Hitler's distrust deepened. Orders became micromanaged. Every decision funneled through him. He interfered in the smallest movements, insisting that every position be held at all costs. Casualty figures were altered, reports sugar-coated, and entire units written off the books. Defeats were described as tactical withdrawals, victories fabricated. A distorted reality replaced the battlefield. Rommel tried to warn him. Without air superiority or freedom to maneuver troops, the front would collapse, he argued. Hitler listened in silence. Then Rommel's car was hit in an airstrike. Wounded and removed from command, he never returned. From that point, Hitler's paranoia grew. He distrusted generals, changed commanders weekly, and bypassed the chain of command entirely. Nights were spent pacing the bunker halls, muttering about loyalty, writing frantic notes, sending letters to the dead. Decisions were no longer grounded in reality. Counterattacks were ordered with phantom units. Defensive lines were built behind already lost positions. Resources were wasted, soldiers left confused, unarmed, or starving. In Normandy, German units were annihilated, reserves vanished, reinforcements never came. The high command existed only in name. Reality was replaced by fantasy, maps and speeches shaping impossible orders. The collapse in Normandy was not just a military defeat. It was a command structure lost in delusion. Every delay, every false report guaranteed more losses in the days to come. After Falaise, there was no front to speak of. The German lines in France had crumbled. Soldiers who had survived the encirclement staggered along side roads and dirt paths, often on foot, without radios, little ammo, and no clear orders. Convoys had vanished. Vehicles were abandoned, trucks burned, artillery stuck in mud. Each group moved alone, picking a direction and hoping for safety. The countryside had changed. French civilians, once hidden, now watched openly. Resistance fighters seized bridges, raided patrols, and operated without fear. The occupation that had ruled so strictly for years was evaporating. Abandoned roads were littered with debris, broken wagons, scattered uniforms, papers scattered in mud. Men walked in silence, small groups of wounded or barefoot soldiers, many stripped of insignia. Corporal Karl Henser recalled crossing a makeshift bridge over the Seine, finding no one waiting. No trucks, no medics, no leaders. Only more exhausted soldiers asking the same question. Where now? Paris fell without a fight. The German flag was lowered quietly. Some left messages promising a return. Others destroyed their weapons. Command was gone. Hitler ignored France, focusing on the Eastern Front. Soldiers retreated across Belgium and Luxembourg toward Germany, encountering chaos at every step. Train stations overflowed with wounded and fleeing units. Hospitals refused more patients. Lieutenants wandered weeks without knowing whom to report to, eventually shuffled into replacement units that barely existed. Morale was gone. Surviving became the only goal. Desertions rose. Some soldiers hid in villages, fled to farms, or surrendered to the Allies. Others were caught and executed, bodies left along roads as warnings. Letters from the front stopped arriving. Families received only vague notifications. The few surviving generals were summoned to Berlin, most dismissed or quietly disappeared. The Central Command existed only on paper, issuing orders that no one could follow. As winter came, the remnants of the army struggled in tattered coats, worn boots, and hunger. Trenches and defensive lines were set, but there weren't enough men or supplies to hold them. For those retreating from Normandy, every step home was a march through ruins, memories of chaos, and the bitter realization that the army that once seemed invincible was now nothing more than a shadow, fleeing through its own destruction.
Lost the poker face look. The SS, the parachute troops,
After D-Day, the German army lost any real chance to control the fight. Units were cut off from one another, radios dead, couriers delayed or killed. Orders crawled across broken lines, often arriving after the moment to act had passed. Hitler still expected the main attack elsewhere, leaving reserves frozen while the Allies pushed inland. Armored divisions moved too slowly to stop the advance. Fixed defenses collapsed one by one, and fallback positions were abandoned. Soldiers were isolated, without air cover, and sometimes trapped in towns under constant fire. Exhaustion, confusion, and fear replaced discipline. Retreat became survival. Normandy marked the point when the Western Front ceased functioning as an organized army. The structure had unraveled, leaving chaos in its wake. The war continued, but for these men, the nightmare had already begun.